When you spend your entire childhood being treated like a ghost, you learn how to haunt a house. You learn that power isn't always about loud confrontations or dramatic standoffs. Sometimes, real power is found in the quiet, unseen moments. It's in the subtle shift of an object, the creation of a minor inconvenience, the slow, steady drip of frustration that can drive people mad. My narcissistic mother and her abusive husband spent 15 years trying to erase me, to make me feel like a burden for the very air I breathed. They succeeded in making me feel invisible, but they made a critical mistake. They forgot that the person nobody sees is the person who can do anything. They grounded me for having one perfect day of happiness. And in doing so, they unleashed a month-long campaign of petty, silent, and deeply satisfying revenge that taught me for the first time how to fight back, not with my voice, but with my very presence.
The crime that led to my month-long sentence was simple. I was happy. For one single, sun-drenched day, my grandmother whisked me away from the oppressive gray of my home life and showed me what it felt like to be a cherished child. We went to the beach, we ate at a real restaurant, we laughed. It was a brief, beautiful escape. But upon returning, I was met not with questions about my day, but with a wall of fury. My crime wasn't going to the beach. It was being selfish for not insisting that my golden child sister come along. I was grounded for experiencing joy without including the family's favorite. It was absurd. It was unjust, and it was the final push I needed. They wanted to lock me away for a month as punishment, but they didn't realize they were just giving me a captive audience and all the time in the world to perfect my craft.
Living in that house was like holding your breath underwater, never knowing when you could surface for air. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken rules and the constant simmering rage of my stepfather, Greg. Every day was a masterclass in making myself small, in becoming human wallpaper. I learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the tight set of my mother's jaw. A set of keys tossed too loudly onto the counter could signal a coming storm. A dish left in the sink was not a simple mistake. It was a personal insult, a sign of my inherent laziness and disrespect. I was the family's emotional dumping ground, the convenient scapegoat for every frustration, big or small. If Greg had a bad day at work, it was my fault for leaving my shoes by the door. If my mother was upset about a bill, it was my fault for existing and costing them money. I wasn't a daughter. I was a problem to be managed. Greg's abuse was loud and explosive. He was a man whose only emotional setting was anger. I remember one evening he spent 10 minutes screaming at me, his face red and contorted because he couldn't find the TV remote. He accused me of hiding it, of being malicious and defiant, all while it was sitting right beside him, tucked between the couch cushions. There was no reasoning with him. An apology was seen as an admission of guilt, and silence was seen as insolence. His presence filled every room with a low-grade terror. You could feel the pressure change when he walked in. The air would get heavy, and my shoulders would instinctively hunch, bracing for the inevitable impact of his mood. He was a walking explosion, and I was the designated blast zone, tasked with absorbing the shrapnel to protect everyone else. My mother's abuse was quieter, but in many ways more insidious. She was the master of the backhanded compliment, the gaslighting comment that made me question my own sanity. If I managed to get a good grade on a test, she would say, "Oh, that's nice, dear. It's good you're trying so hard, even if you're not naturally gifted like your sister." She would rewrite history in real time, denying things she had said or done just moments before, looking at me with wide, innocent eyes until I was the one apologizing, convinced I had misremembered everything. She enabled Greg's rage, often being the one to light the fuse. She would complain to him in a hushed, martyred voice about something I had supposedly done, then sit back with a look of sad resignation as he unleashed his fury on me. She wasn't just a bystander, she was the architect of my misery. The foundation of this toxic ecosystem was the blatant, unapologetic favoritism shown to my younger sister, Ashley. She was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. While I wore secondhand clothes and was constantly reminded of how expensive I was, Ashley was showered with new outfits, new gadgets, and endless praise. Her mediocrity was celebrated as genius, while my genuine efforts were ignored or belittled. This constant comparison was a tool they used to keep me in my place, to remind me that I was the lesser, the disappointment. It created a chasm between my sister and me, not of her making, but of their design. She was not just my sister. She was a living, breathing symbol of my own inadequacy in their eyes, a constant reminder of the love and approval I would never receive. This dynamic of exclusion was never more apparent than the week before my beach trip. The entire family, my mother, Greg, and all my siblings, packed up for a week-long trip to a lake house. I was not invited. The excuse was flimsy, something about there not being enough room. But the message was crystal clear. I was not wanted. I and my grandmother, who often acted as my buffer and protector, were left behind. I remember watching them load the car, the coolers, the inflatable toys, all symbols of a happy family life that I was not a part of. The silence in the house after they drove away was deafening. It was a silence that screamed, "You do not belong. You are not one of us." It was a familiar pain, but it cut deeper that time, leaving a wound that was still fresh when my grandmother offered me my one day of reprieve. My grandmother was my only sanctuary. Her home was a place where I could breathe, where I wasn't a burden, but a granddaughter to be cherished. She was a warm, sturdy presence in the constant storm of my life. She never badmouthed my mother or Greg, but she saw everything. She saw the way I flinched, the way I tried to make myself invisible. Her hugs were the only genuine affection I knew. Her quiet support was the only thing that kept me from completely shattering. She would slip me $20 for a new book or take me out for ice cream. These small acts of normalcy feeling like grand gestures of love. She was the one who told me I was smart, that I was kind, that I was worthy. She was the reason I knew that the distorted reality of my home was not the whole world. She was my anchor. And her simple invitation to the beach was an act of rebellion on my behalf, a lifeline I grabbed with both hands. My grandmother's call felt like a whispered secret, a conspiracy of kindness just for me. "Maya," she'd said, her voice warm and steady, "I'm coming to get you tomorrow morning. Pack a bag with a swimsuit and a change of clothes. We're going on an adventure." An adventure. The word itself was foreign in my world of muted colors and quiet dread. That night, I packed my bag in silence, a giddy, nervous energy thrumming through me. It felt like I was planning an escape. I chose my favorite swimsuit, a book to read on the sand, and the seashell collecting bag she'd given me years ago. I fell asleep with a rare, genuine smile on my face, dreaming of the sun and the sound of waves, a world away from the suffocating walls of my home. The day was a masterpiece of simple joys. My grandmother let me control the radio on the drive, and we sang along terribly to old songs. When we finally arrived at the beach, the bright sun and the salty air felt like a baptism. We kicked off our shoes and ran into the cool, churning waves, letting them knock us around like little kids. We weren't a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. We were just two people, enjoying the ocean. We spent hours walking along the shoreline, my grandmother pointing out different types of birds while I filled my bag with shimmering, unbroken shells. She bought me a ridiculous sun hat from a boardwalk shop and a giant cone of strawberry ice cream that dripped down my hands. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely and utterly normal. After the beach, she took me to a small, charming seafood restaurant with checkered tablecloths. I ordered fried shrimp, and we talked for over an hour. She asked me about school, about my friends, about the books I was reading. She listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made me feel like the most important person in the world. After lunch, we went to a little maritime museum nearby, a quiet, cool place filled with old ship models and strange artifacts pulled from the deep. I wasn't being yelled at. I wasn't being ignored. I wasn't walking on eggshells. I was being treated with interest and respect. I was being cherished. That day, my grandmother didn't just take me to the beach. She gave me back a piece of myself that I thought was lost forever. The feeling of peace shattered the moment we pulled into my driveway. I could feel the atmosphere shift before I even opened the car door. The house looked darker, more menacing. When I walked inside, my bag of seashells clinking softly, I was met with a chilling silence. My mother and Greg were sitting in the living room, their faces set like stone. They didn't ask about my day. They didn't comment on my sunburnt nose. They waited, letting the silence stretch, letting the dread build in my stomach. I knew instantly that I had done something wrong. My one day of happiness was about to be weaponized against me, and I was utterly defenseless against the coming storm. I stood in the entryway, the smell of salt and sun still on my skin, and braced myself. The explosion came from my mother first, her voice laced with a venomous, syrupy sweetness. Well, look who decided to come home, she began. I hope you had a lovely time, being so selfish and self-absorbed. I was confused. What are you talking about? Greg stood up then, his voice a low growl. Your sister sat here all day, bored out of her mind, while you were out having fun. Did it ever occur to your selfish little brain that maybe she would have liked to go to the beach too? You should have told your grandmother to take Ashley. The accusation was so breathtakingly absurd, it left me speechless. I, a 15-year-old child, was being blamed for the plans made by an adult. I was responsible for my sister's entertainment, for my grandmother's actions. It was a twisted, impossible logic designed for one purpose, to ensure that any joy I experienced would be immediately tainted with guilt.
They grounded me. The official charge was being selfish and leaving your sister behind. The sentence was a month, a full month confined to the house with no phone, no computer, no friends. As I stood there, absorbing the verdict, something inside me shifted. The usual fear and the desperate need for their approval were gone. The injustice of it was so stark, so profoundly unfair, that it burned away all the softer emotions. In their place, a cold, hard resolve began to form. They had taken my one perfect day and turned it into a weapon against me. They wanted to punish me. Fine. But if I was going to be a prisoner in my own home, I wasn't going to be a quiet, compliant one. They had created a menace, and I was about to spend the next month showing them just how menacing I could be.
My campaign of petty revenge began the very next morning. It started small, a simple test of physics and psychology. Before my shower, I deliberately pulled the diverter knob up, the little pin that switches the water flow from the bath faucet to the shower head. After my shower, I left it up. I also made sure to turn the temperature dial all the way to cold before shutting it off. I knew Greg was
always the next to shower, and I knew he never checked. I was sitting in my room pretending to read when I heard the sudden blast of water, followed by a furious, sputtering roar. "Who the fuck left the shower on? The cold water sprayed me all over!" A quiet, triumphant giggle escaped my lips. It worked. The first shot had been fired and I had hit my target. It was a small victory, but it was mine, and it felt like a revolution.
From there, my operations expanded. I became a student of household entropy, a silent agent of chaos. The bathroom was a key battleground. I noticed that my mother and Greg were lazy about replacing the toilet paper. So every single time I saw a roll getting low, I would make a point to use the last few squares. I wouldn't just leave an empty cardboard tube. That was too obvious. I would leave a single, useless square clinging to the roll, a testament to their impending doom. For my own needs, I had a secret stash of wet wipes in my backpack. Hearing my mother's exasperated sigh from the bathroom, followed by the call for a new roll, became a daily dose of satisfaction. It was a simple, constant reminder that their comfort was no longer guaranteed.
The kitchen became my next theater of war. My reign of inconvenience was subtle but effective. Every morning, before they came downstairs for their coffee, I would quietly unplug everything on the counter. The microwave, the coffee maker, the air fryer, the toaster. It wasn't destructive, just annoying. They would stumble into the kitchen, bleary-eyed, press the start button on the microwave, and nothing would happen. The momentary confusion, the groan of frustration as they had to trace the cord back to the wall, it was a small tax I levied on their daily routine. I was disrupting the very heart of the home, the place of nourishment from which I was so often emotionally excluded, making it just a little bit harder for them to function. My technological warfare was slightly more sophisticated. We had a shared family computer in the living room, which they often used. At night, after they had gone to bed, I would sneak out and log out of every single account. The main computer profile, their email, their social media, everything. They were not tech savvy, and they rarely remembered their passwords. The next day would be filled with frustrated mutterings, calls to tech support, and the tedious process of password resets. I was creating mental friction, forcing them to waste their time and energy on problems I had created out of thin air. I was a ghost in their machine, a digital poltergeist, a crying that was entirely of their own making. Perhaps my most artistically chaotic act took place in the pantry. One afternoon, filled with a particularly strong sense of malicious creativity, I took every single canned good we owned, soups, vegetables, beans, tuna, and I peeled off the labels. All of them. I was left with a shelf full of identical, anonymous silver cans. Dinner became a game of pantry roulette. Were they opening a can of green beans for their casserole or a can of sliced peaches? The sheer randomness of it was beautiful. It was a form of sabotage that couldn't be traced or proven, a perfect, unsolvable mystery that introduced a tiny bit of anarchy into their well-ordered world every time they wanted to cook. As the month wore on, my tactics escalated. The inconveniences became more tangible. I began a systematic campaign against the household cutlery. Spoon by spoon, fork by fork, knife by knife, I started throwing them away in the outside garbage bin late at night. Within 2 weeks, they started noticing. "Where are all the forks?" my mother would ask, bewildered. They searched every drawer. They accused each other of misplacing them. Their confusion was delicious. Meanwhile, my grandmother, my co-conspirator, had supplied me with a large stash of plastic cutlery, which we used in secret. Their frustration culminated in a loud, angry argument over the last remaining spoon, an argument I listened to from my room with immense satisfaction.
The final phase of my campaign was about attacking their comfort and basic household functions. I logged out of every streaming app on the smart TV, Netflix, Hulu, everything. As I suspected, no one knew the passwords or could be bothered to go through the recovery process. Their evening entertainment was gone, replaced by arguments over what to watch on basic cable. And for the cherry on top, on the day before the city's weekly garbage pickup, I gathered every single trash bag in the house, the full ones from the kitchen and bathrooms, and the entire roll of new ones from under the sink, and disposed of them in a neighbor's bin down the street. The next morning, they were left with overflowing trash cans and no way to dispose of anything. The sheer fury at having to make a special trip to the store for something as mundane as garbage bags was the perfect endnote to my symphony of petty revenge. The atmosphere in the house during that month was a masterpiece of simmering, low-grade misery. It was thick with their confusion and impotent anger. They knew something was wrong, that the universe had seemingly tilted against them, but they couldn't find the source. Little household functions that had always been seamless were now filled with friction. Their morning coffee was a two-step process. Their dinner plans were a mystery. Their spoons vanished into thin air. They were living in a house that had been subtly booby-trapped by an invisible force, and the constant, nagging inconveniences began to wear them down, fraying their already thin patience and exposing the cracks in their own relationship. The true payoff wasn't just their frustration, it was watching them turn on each other. Unable to pin the escalating chaos on me, after all, I was grounded and quietly reading in my room, they began to blame one another. Greg accused my mother of being disorganized and forgetful when the microwave wouldn't work. She accused him of being careless and losing the cutlery. Their arguments became more frequent, their voices sharper. My campaign of silent, petty disruptions had effectively removed me as the primary target. I was no longer the sole cause of their displeasure. By creating a dozen other small problems, I had forced them to confront their own intolerance for each other, and it was a sight to behold. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of agency. I was not a passive victim absorbing their abuse. I was an active, albeit secret, agent of my own reality. I couldn't stop their yelling or their neglect, but I could make sure Greg got a blast of cold water in the morning. I couldn't force them to love me, but I could ensure they had to eat their soup with a plastic fork. These small, childish acts of rebellion were my survival. They were a way for me to carve out a tiny space of power in a world where I had none. It was a silent, one-person resistance movement, and it taught me that even when you feel completely powerless, there are always ways to push back. Looking back now, as a 23-year-old, long after I have gone completely no contact with them, I don't feel a shred of guilt. Was it petty? Absolutely. Was I a menace? Without a doubt. But that month was not just about revenge. It was a crucial turning point. That campaign of inconveniences was the first time I realized I didn't have to passively accept my circumstances. It was the first time I fought back in a way they couldn't control. It was the training ground for the much bigger act of rebellion years later, walking away for good. The girl who learned to hide the spoons was the same woman who eventually learned how to save her own life. When you are raised in an environment of control and abuse, your spirit learns to survive in the shadows. True rebellion doesn't always begin with a roar. Often, it starts with a whisper. It's born in the small, unseen acts of defiance, the misplaced object, the hidden roll of toilet paper, the secret that is yours alone. These are not just acts of revenge, they're acts of self-preservation. They're the first few sentences in a story of liberation, the quiet practice for the day you will finally be loud. They teach you that even when your voice is silenced, you can still make yourself heard. And sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is to become an elegant, unsolvable, and deeply inconvenient problem.